When you think of the state of Kansas, what's the first image that comes to mind? Maybe a sunflower, or a vast, treeless expanse of softly blowing grass and wildflowers? Kansas is a genuine prairie state, after all. The largest remaining piece of original tallgrass prairie is right here in the beautiful Flint Hills. It's something we make a special point to celebrate every June on National Prairie Day. Sadly, though, this already rare ecosystem is under a major threat because of us.
Keep a great thing growing, America. Tree City, USA. From the canyons of Manhattan to the blue Pacific shore, trees are making a big difference all across America.
For decades, it's been this environmental mantra that if we want to save the planet, we need to plant more trees. But here on the Great Plains, this practice is majorly backfiring. Our prairies are being replaced by this giant dark green blanket of trees and shrubs. Scientists are dubbing it the Green Glacier. I'm Mackenzie Martin, and this is The People's History of Kansas City, a podcast from KCUR Studios about renegades and everyday heroes. And on this episode, we're focusing on the ultimate Kansas underdog, the prairie.
Prairie is the largest ecosystem not brought into the National Park Service, and we still don't have a prairie national park.
And the ranchers who are trying to save it.
If a coral reef is worth saving, if some pristine mountain stream is worth saving, then so are the Flint Hills.
So I first heard about the Green Glacier from the new podcast Up From Dust. It's from KCUR Studios and the Kansas News Service, and it's hosted by environmental reporters Celia Yopis-Jepsen and David Kondos. And what I love so much about Up From Dust is that in addition to teaching us about these environmental problems that humans helped cause, it also introduces us to actual people who are working to fix things. Here's Celia and David.
All right, so David, a lot of people would point out trees are good.
Yeah, trees are great, just not when they go where they aren't supposed to be.
You know, a horizon that is treeless used to be one of the things talked about so often in settlers' accounts and so forth. These horizons are now rare.
That's why Direct Twidwell and other scientists at the University of Nebraska launched a public education campaign.
We're seeing the loss of the Great Plains biome.
On how woody plants are destroying prairies.
We've had almost the elimination of the ability to support grazing animals.
And not long after, the federal government launched another big program based on decades of science from Kansas State University, Oklahoma State, Nebraska, and other colleges. And that program's called the Great Plains Grassland Initiative. But why would these scientists and the Federal Natural Resources Conservation Service want to run basically this targeted anti-tree campaign in the first place? Well, let's start with some prairie basics.
It is time for a prairie primer, with help from the aptly named book, Prairie, A Natural History of the Heart of North America by Candace Savage. You gotta love a book that opens with the line, "There are people who think the prairie is boring, and it is hard not to pity them." So, if you live in the middle of the continent, but you live in like a city or a suburb and you feel really cut off from the prairie, like, what is the prairie? Where is the prairie? Pick up this book. Seriously, it is like all the coolest science and history and animals that make the grasslands just this amazing ecosystem that we would be so sad to lose. So, a few hundred years ago, vast expanses of grass and wildflowers covered the middle of the continent, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1 million square miles. I mean, sources on it vary, but the National Park Service puts it this way. A third of North America back then was grassland.
I really, really wish I could have been there to see it back then, Celia. I mean, this prairie supported unbelievable numbers of wildlife, and just not, bison, like how a lot of us think of it. I mean, there were wolves, there were grizzly bears in Kansas. I mean, that must have been a wild, wild scene.
Now, where were the trees and shrubs back then? They were largely held at bay. They were just really marginal numbers of trees back then. And a key reason was that indigenous peoples burned the prairie to manage their landscape. Now, this made for fantastic hunting, among other benefits, because recently burned grassland regrows super nutritious. So, every time people would burn the prairie, herds of bison would show up. But the U.S. government and settlers cheated, killed, forcibly removed Native Americans from most of the Great Plains,
which eliminated fire from much of the landscape.
And there's more to this story, David. As Europeans showed up and made their way inland and saw these endless grasslands, it blew their ever-loving minds. From the Spaniards who saw them in the 1500s to the European immigrants and American homesteaders that came to farm the Great Plains a few hundred years later, the reviews were generally along the lines of oh my God, there is nothing here. What the actual bleep? One famous Spanish explorer, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, said it was like being swallowed by the sea.
And he literally had to cross an actual ocean just to get to this continent.
Yeah, Candace Savage writes, people from Europe didn't even know what to call this thing that they were seeing. There weren't grasslands like this in their countries. And that's how fur traders ended up calling it a prairie, which is just the French word for a meadow.
A meadow is not even remotely like a prairie. A meadow is like you've been walking through the forest, you reach a little clearing, there's a creek, and it's surrounded by a little bit of grass.
The newcomers were not exactly really fans. The soil was good for farming, yes, but they wanted trees to block the wind, to build their style of homes, and maybe more than anything, just to make this new to them, very strange to them place more like the world they knew. And so began a tree planting bonanza on the vast prairie. The origin of Arbor Day actually dates back to 1872, when Nebraskans planted 1 million trees in a single day. A few decades later, Nebraskans planted a massive man-made forest that is now a national forest and the biggest hand-planted forest in the Western Hemisphere. And then in the 1970s,
conservation trees, where leafy canopies cool the sun.
Nebraskans created what I can only assume is the one organization in the world that's most closely associated with planting trees.
To write the National Arbor Day Foundation for your free conservation trees brochure.
Now, as a former Nebraskan, Celia, I feel like I should say that it is not all entirely Nebraska's fault. The Dust Bowl happened.
So the Dust Bowl, nearly a century ago, decades of plowing up the prairie totally backfired.
Over farming, plus really bad drought, plus really bad heat, essentially equaled hell on Earth.
The dust clouds looked like the special effects straight out of an Armageddon movie. I mean, thousands of people died in the Dust Bowl, countless animals. And this is the point when the federal government, which had already been encouraging and rewarding tree planting on the plains, really put its back into adding more trees. And the idea was save farms by planting a few 100 million trees right down the center of the Great Plains to slow the wind and hold onto the soil.
But eventually, all of those trees started reproducing. And then purposeful fire was pretty much gone.
But it's not even just that. Two more really critical things, David. Industrialization.
It's CO2.
That's Professor Jesse Nippert, a grassland ecologist at Kansas State University.
It's more than a key contributor. It's probably the main reason.
Turns out, increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere doesn't just cause global warming. It makes shrubs and trees grow faster and beat out prairie wildflowers and grasses.
So another reason to stress out about greenhouse gases.
Yeah, and David, one more really important thing. Great big browsers, like elk. We've eliminated them from most of their range. K-State is in the Flint Hills and runs a major research area, the Konza Prairie Biological Station. So just to give you an example, they burned shrub-infested prairie every single year for 2 decades to try to get the shrubs out. That is a lot of fire, and it didn't work.
Those shrubs are still everywhere, and in fact, they expanded.
But when they added hungry, shrub-eating beasts,
elk eating them and then hit them with fire, and we killed the shrubs. That's the only thing we've ever done that killed them.
So in other words, that animal is a very important part of the ecosystem, and it is largely gone.
So it's just like all these changes in the past century and a half or so have been kind of setting this stage for the prairies to lose out. Enter the Green Glacier. And the official sciencey name is woody encroachment.
It's not a very attention-grabbing name, is it, for something that's wiping out what's left of a huge ecosystem? I mean, half of America's grassland birds, for example, have disappeared in 50 years. Half. And I know the Green Glacier, trees and shrubs are not the only reason. Birds have lost so much habitat to human development, cropland, but the Green Glacier is a juggernaut sweeping the little habitat they have left.
Prairie chickens, meadowlarks, species that are really iconic to the open country out here. I mean, 5 Great Plains states have meadowlark as their state bird.
Including Kansas.
And Nebraska. And I have distinct memories of being out reporting on dirt roads in western Kansas and hearing a meadowlark sing. I mean, they're beautiful.
And all sorts of special prairie wildflowers and bees and reptiles and fish, they need the prairie to keep existing.
Now, it's hard to visualize the Green Glacier since it's happening on such a large scale. But the U.S. Department of Agriculture has these great maps that help it hit home. So we'll post them on our website, but basically imagine mapping out all the grass and all the trees and all the shrubs in the United States. And in a map like this from the year 2000, you'll see just like the very eastern edge of Kansas is dominated by woody stuff, those trees and shrubs. The rest of the state is mostly grass. Now, I'm just going to eyeball it. It feels like less than 1/10 of the state is trees in that map from 2000. Then, looking at the same map, but in 2018, again, just eyeballing it, maybe half the state is now pretty seriously invaded with those trees.
Holy cats, 2 short decades.
Yeah, and for those who haven't seen what this looks like in a place like Kansas, don't picture just one solid forest across this whole half of the state. But still, it's a lot of trees. And some of them are thick woods, some of them are collected in groves, some of them are just scattered trees. That tree coverage is starting to extend all the way west past Wichita now. And you can see them radiating out from farmhouses, from ranchettes, from suburbs. Other Great Plains states, from Texas to the Dakotas, are having the same conundrum.
David, I think it's time to talk about the tree.
Right, the tree. So there are some species that grow and spread so slowly that scientists aren't as worried about having them on the prairie, like oaks and hickories. Having some around your house or along a stream is not a cause for panic. Then there are other trees and shrubs, like the rough-leaf dogwood and American plum, that are very much a threat to prairie. But if you are in Kansas, or Nebraska, or Oklahoma, or even parts of South Dakota, Missouri, and Iowa, there is one tree that is the most prominent symbol of the Green Glacier: eastern red cedars. This species is the focus of that University of Nebraska campaign we talked about, with the whole website full of these maps and explainers and everything dedicated to it specifically.
Side note here, it is not actually a cedar. It's actually a juniper tree, but whatever, people call it red cedar. It is kind of this pretty typical looking Christmassy evergreen shape, dark green, sometimes reddish color, but not much light gets through them, so they kill off all the prairie plants under them. They're native to the U.S., and they aren't always a problem.
So if you live on the East Coast, for example, don't freak out. We aren't talking about your area. That's a totally different ecosystem.
But here, these trees that had always been just kind of stuck in the margins are now wholesale replacing the grasslands with woodlands. And Nippert at K-State figures a lot of it will never go back. The really dense juniper forests that have sprung up around Manhattan, Kansas, it would just be so expensive, and you'd have to convince so many landowners.
As a naturalist and a conservation person, I want the grasses back. But if these areas that have turned into juniper forests, we're probably not going to get them back.
Jesse, you're breaking my heart.
I know. I think we protect what we can protect. We try and restore the areas that can be restored.
Red cedars are just part of the problem. Nippert says the shrubs, like wild plum, are even worse. They might not be so attention-grabbing when you drive down I-70 as seeing those big junipers everywhere, but they're spreading so much and they're practically unkillable on such large scales. So protecting the prairie means finding better ways to keep all these woody plants that are wonderful elsewhere but a nightmare on the prairie at bay.
To stop them from swallowing the whole prairie, we need things like fire and chainsaws. But you know what is especially helpful, Celia? A solid understanding of animal poop.
Let's start there.
So until now, we had basically been trying to stop the Green Glacier by cutting and burning and poisoning trees here and there, like just clearing out patches of them one at a time. Direct Twidwell wants the world to know this is not working.
We've spent a lot of money over the last several decades and last several farm bills to the tune of $177 million in the last farm bill.
It's like a game of whack-a-mole, where the moles are very clearly winning.
And so we just have more and more and more sites to treat over time. And that experiment failed.
We need a new strategy. In a nutshell, animals help spread cedars by eating their cones and pooping out their seeds, especially birds. And 95% of the time, the seed lands within 2 football fields from the tree where they got it from. And that's a good thing, because
we can manage football fields.
So what Dirac tells these ranchers to do is called defending the core. So take a swath of prairie that's tree-free or as tree-free as possible, and then basically look in every direction. You see any cedars, you kill them. Then keep moving that perimeter outward.
So it's like we're saving the prairie a football field length at a time.
Right. So the treeless spot in the middle grows and grows and becomes safer and safer from the other cedar seeds that may be swooping in via bird poop. And then those areas become easier and easier to protect with good old prairie burns, which are a heck of a lot cheaper than taking out trees one at a time with heavy machines and chainsaws.
And that's really the change in philosophy and thinking. Our traditional guidance has been reactive.
Now, the Federal Resources Conservation Service is on board with this, and it's spreading the gospel and giving ranchers money to ramp up this approach in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and they're focusing on the highest quality prairies we have left.
Like the Flint Hills.
Yep, and the Gypsum Hills and the Smoky Hills, also in Kansas, or the Sand Hills in Nebraska.
Ranchers have told me they are excited to give this a try. They can only produce as many cattle as they have grass for, and every tree and bush and thicket eats into their livelihoods, and they are sick of seeing these woody plants creep up.
So I knew it was happening on my ranch more than what it was, say, 20 years ago. My neighbor would have said the same thing.
Meet Daniel Mushrush, a third-generation rancher.
I ranch with my parents, 2 brothers, and my wife. Started out with my grandfather before he passed, and now my kids are coming up next in line.
The Mushrush Ranch includes a red Angus herd, about 800 head, plus there are a couple thousand other cattle in the summers trucked in to feed on the land here. And in total, they've got 15,000 acres of tallgrass prairie.
In the world of ranching, is that big, small, medium?
That's a loaded question. Well, the average herd size in the U.S. is only around 50 head. So if you're looking at it nationally, I guess you'd say we're pretty big. Because we're in Chase County, Kansas, in the middle of the Flint Hills, there's a lot bigger fish in this pond than me. So
The family gets financial help from the federal government to try this new way of beating the Green Glacier. And one thing Daniel likes is that the USDA and University of Montana built this tool called the Rangeland Analysis Platform with satellite imagery. So ranchers can see what's growing on their property and how much grass they're losing over the years because of trees.
It paints the picture very simply. It's actual science. It's as real as gravity.
Aerial photos from 80 years ago show this property was tree-free. So now the family is chopping down trees to try to get back to that point.
A longer-term winter project that I'm doing here is I'm taking all these trees out.
Hindsight is 2020. Daniel's own family once planted trees.
Like my grandma had stories about planting Osage orange hedgerows.
Oh, I've seen those. So those are like those weird, like lime green, bumpy softball things, right?
They'd dig a trench, they'd put all the hedge balls in a cement grinder, mix them into a slurry, and then pour the slurry in the trench and then cover it up.
He can't imagine doing that now.
Elms are trouble. Eastern red cedars are maybe the worst. And then there's different brushes too. Sericea lespedeza is the one that drives us in the Flint Hills absolutely crazy. You can walk into any hardware store in Missouri right now and buy it. Buy the seed. It should be right up with heroin and cocaine for me. I think it should.
You mean it should be banned?
Yeah, you shouldn't be able to have it.
Wow. So even today, that's still part of the challenge, is that people are out there planting these problem species.
Yeah, well, it's complicated, David. So people still plant eastern red cedars, for example. They like them for windbreaks, like to help crops grow. And like a lot of deer hunters and ranchette owners, like they want these trees because they want privacy, or they hope that like the trees will bring them better hunting. All this is very much a sore point for ranchers if they're like fighting trees on their property right next to someone who's letting trees spread.
Yeah, I mean, that has to be pretty annoying because we're talking about their livelihoods here. And, that's not the only bad thing happening. The Green Glacier is also fueling out-of-control wildfires.
Hey, it's Mackenzie Martin. I just wanted to pop in and say that if you're liking this episode, which is sort of taking us back in time and imagining what the state of Kansas used to be like, there's another episode you might enjoy. It's called Was Kansas City Almost Named Possum Trot? And it's all about how we landed on the name of our fair city and how local lore and wild stories sometimes get twisted over time. That and nearly 40 other episodes are waiting for you right now by scrolling down in your feed. Be sure and check them out. Now back to the show.
So Celia, let's talk fire. The West Coast grabs a lot of the national headlines for wildfires just because so many people live there, but Great Plains wildfires are also a force to be reckoned with. And the University of Nebraska found that over the past 30 years, the amount of land that burns in really big wildfires on the plains each year increased 5-fold.
Hey, that trench line right there. We got about 50 feet. Dig deep!
I got to follow along with a wildfire training in western Kansas last spring near Scott City.
Break the mat up. Let's go.
Dozens of people digging fire breaks.
We're almost there.
Firefighter students from Hutchinson Community College, Kansas Forest Service, firefighters from nearby towns. And this kind of practice is important because when a wildfire strikes, you got to move fast. And so you have to clear these long lines of grass about 2 feet wide to head off the flames. But when there are trees and brush around, you have to cut even wider. And when there are a lot of these red cedars, even that may not be enough.
These cedars are very volatile, especially when they're stressed.
That's Troy Mueller, a captain with the Hutchinson Fire Department. And when he says the trees are stressed, he means stressed by drought.
When they catch fire, they will torch, and they look like a Roman candle going off. And they will throw hot embers out, and they'll catch in the wind, and they'll spread the fire a quarter mile.
A Roman candle. I mean, I see a billion of these juniper trees when I'm driving around Kansas, so honestly, I am not super excited to think about how flammable these are in drought.
Right. I mean, if you think back to March of 2016, that's when the Anderson Creek fire burned nearly 500,000 acres in Kansas and Oklahoma. And a year later, 2 million acres in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas burned in the Starbuck fire and other blazes around the same time. These trees were a big reason those blazes were so hard to control. It's dry weather, plus high winds, plus giant Roman candles.
Now, the University of Nebraska says you can have 90-foot tall flames when you're dealing with a red cedar wildfire, compared to like 15 feet for a grassland wildfire. And climate change could make all of this worse because some scientists are predicting Kansas and nearby states will get a lot more days that are like dry and windy and just super ripe for wildfire. Days like December 15th, 2021.
That's when 54 wildfires burned across 34 Kansas counties, essentially at the same time. More than 120,000 acres burned just before Christmas.
I'm going to have our photojournalist James Hayer go ahead and pan to the left. You can still see over the horizon very large wildfires still being handled.
Roads. It's hard to find, how these fires are starting, how many of them there are, what direction they're going.
And the gusts from that windstorm clocked in at about 100 miles per hour. I mean, I was there. I remember stepping out into my front yard in Hayes just to feel what that's like. I'm telling you, Celia, it just about blew me over into a fence. I have never felt something like that before. It was intense. And, on that day, the winds were so intense that it's hard to say, if the trees were the ones to blame for how bad it got. But this fire is still worth talking about because you can really hear the toll this type of destruction can have in rural areas.
I don't know where to start, what to say. I mean, where you want me to start at?
The absolute worst of it struck in the Smoky Hills in north central Kansas.
Well, my name's Rich Kessler, and my voice is kind of hard. It doesn't help either. I haven't got much sleep, and the dirt and the dust and from the fire and the smoke and everything doesn't help it any.
I went to see the destruction a few days after that fire swept through, and I met Rich on his 800 acres near the town of Paradise. Rural wildfires like this easily rack up millions of dollars in damage to homes, ranch fences, and livestock. They can scorch cropland so bad it becomes kind of sterile and hard to grow crops on afterwards. And just in the past decade, thousands of livestock have died in wildfires in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And the night of this fire, Rich couldn't get anywhere near his animals to save them.
When I first found out that there was a fire up here and it was reported, at one time they said it was 35 miles long and 10 miles deep. It was burning so fast, and a lot of the cattle didn't have a chance, and some of them were trying to get away from it. They were in the bottom of the draws and the ravines. And then miraculously, I don't know, I didn't know how any of mine survived. I thought maybe... I was so surprised how many of them... Some of them there was nothing wrong with, and then some of them were... Well, anyway, I came up with my wife, my dog, and my four-wheeler to check it out. The more we went through, the more we found the dead ones. They were just everywhere. And even we had some of them where the babies were even underneath the mamas, like the mama was trying to protect them. And I've raised these cows, most all of them from birth, and raised every one of them up. And some of them are, we're going to have calves too. And some of them were still alive, and we had to euthanize them because they weren't going to make it. And that's, that's the hardest thing right there. The first few are really hard, and after that you just think that this is best. This is best, and that's the way we should do it. And that's it, I guess. And we just go on. Maybe close to between half and a third of the herd perished. And then the next days, now we have to deal with the burial, of getting rid of the carcasses and stuff. Yep, that's it.
I watched volunteers help Rich bury some of his dozens of dead cattle in a huge pit. Losses like what he experienced show just how devastating these out-of-control wildfires can be, and it's a reminder of why we need to figure out ways to preempt them.
Carrying out controlled, purposeful fires helps, but good fire, it's not totally easy. Landowners do need the know-how, the hands on deck, the equipment.
And so some landowners do prescribed burns, but not enough of them. And actually, Kansas has a state wildfire task force, and this is one of the top things they're calling for: more resources for landowners and local associations to do prescribed burning.
David, not that we need more reasons to appreciate prairie, but I'm going to put one out there. It is worth noting that prairies store a lot of carbon. John Blair is a grassland ecologist at Kansas State University, and he told me about this.
Yes, it can. And the big advantage of prairies, so prairies, especially tall grass prairies, are grasslands that store tremendous amounts of carbon below ground. In some cases, more than forests would store.
He's the director of the Kanza Prairie Biological Station that I mentioned.
I hadn't thought about how much carbon they could store.
This is because of ultra deep, dense, elaborate root systems and all the soil life around them.
Okay, so I've heard about this. Those roots are deep, sometimes 15 feet deep.
Carbon that's in the soil that the prairie roots have stored below ground is relatively secure and safe.
Secure during fires.
Forest carbon is primarily stored above ground. It's primarily stored actually in the trees and in the litter. When that fire moves through, all of that carbon is released back to the atmosphere as CO2. So it's a very tenuous pool of carbon in terms of its stability.
So when the fires happen on the plains, which we're realizing is inevitable, either as prescribed burns or wildfires, do we want grass fires that keep most of that carbon underground, or do we want junipers that light up like Roman candles and release a bunch of carbon straight into the atmosphere?
Exactly.
Celia, the other thing that's working against prairies is that all of this is happening more or less under the radar. It's kind of crazy. We have this major ecosystem vanishing year by year in this country without a ton of attention nationally.
So many Americans grow up with romantic ideas about, oceans and mountains and forests, but really almost no knowledge or appreciation of grasslands. That really gets Kelly Kincher fired up. So he's a senior scientist at the Kansas Biological Survey and Center for Ecological Research, University of Kansas.
What was the last major ecosystem to be brought in the National Park Service? Prairies. Prairies are the largest ecosystem not brought into the National Park Service, and we still don't have a prairie national park.
What about the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in the Flint Hills?
He's quick to point out, actually, the Nature Conservancy owns it.
Right, and it's not a national park. And this is the largest ecosystem in the North American continent, if you think about it, grasslands.
So why?
Well, I think it was the European perspective again. Prairies are diminutive, prairies are lesser.
So, David, there's a little 5-acre section of prairie. It's a city park right in the middle of Lawrence near where I live. The fact that this tiny prairie survived somehow feels like a bit of a miracle. So it has a lot of fans. But last year, the city sprayed down the whole thing with an herbicide that kills wildflowers. The city apologized, but there was a public outcry, and later, a few hundred people gathered at the park, including Dan Wildcat, the author of 2 books on environmental issues from Native American perspectives.
I'm a Zoyaha-Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma and longtime faculty member at Haskell Indian Nations University.
So the city said spraying the prairie was a mistake, but what does that say?
That just tells us something maybe about the general ignorance of the ecosystems that we're a part of. So I'm hoping this can be a really pivotal event for some learning and maybe some very active steps to protect more of the natural world.
If there's one place in the United States where you would expect maybe people to understand prairies and their value, you would think it would be a prairie state like Kansas, or what used to be a prairie state.
Right, what used to be a prairie state. Yeah, but again, I think all of this to me is just, it's almost like an alarm. It should tell everyone, hey, if we can't recognize a natural wild prairie and realize that, hey, this has been left alone and shows this incredible biological diversity and is not to be sprayed. Like I say, that failure to even kind of have that go off in your mind, we have so few places like this. That's why this hurts so much.
It also seems like the best thing we can do now is help prairies hang on by telling people about them and about the actions that we can take to save them, and that it's not too late.
Not too late, but very urgent. The biome is collapsing.
It is disappearing right in front of our eyes.
That's Jesse Nippert again. At K-State, He and his colleagues are learning that once a swath of Flint Hills prairie is too far gone with woody plants, they just can't restore it, especially after shrubs take hold. So the places that aren't too far gone yet, they're a treasure.
Do what you have to do to keep it the way that it is before it transitions.
So this new federal program we talked about, the one that's focusing on those most intact prairie regions we have left and equipping the landowners to fend off the Green Glacier much more strategically, he says that's the way to go.
I think it's one of the only viable things we have. It's a great idea.
So like in Kansas, the Natural Resources Conservation Service is spending millions on this Great Plains Grassland Initiative. By the end of this fiscal year, it'll be helping protect nearly 220,000 acres of Kansas grassland. And that gives me some hope. There are landowners stepping up to this challenge. Remember, we talked to one of the participants, Daniel Mushrush, the Flint Hills rancher.
Sure.
That first time I interviewed him was in 2022, so we caught up over Zoom.
So how's his fight against trees going?
It's not easy, David, because the family owns a lot of really tricky terrain where they can't just roll in big machinery and, also where regular controlled burning just can't really kill all these woody plants either. Like, we're talking, rocky areas, steep areas, ridges, creeks.
At the end of the day, it's a lot of old-fashioned chainsaw work. Putting on a helmet and a mask and some earplugs, and I have a little spray bottle of the chemical I need to treat the stumps. And it's kind of walking rocky ridges and cutting down trees. You might get done with your other stuff, and maybe there's no other fires to put on the ranch, literally or figuratively. Cut for an afternoon, you cut 15 trees down.
That sounds exhausting.
Right? And ranching is already a tough gig. Still, he really likes this new approach of getting areas like treeless and then expanding the work outward.
It's a morale builder for the actual landowner because you actually feel like you're getting something done. And that's really refreshing. And it works.
After about 3 years, Daniel estimates they've killed somewhere in the ballpark of 10,000 trees.
My gosh, 10,000 trees?
Yeah, and they are not even close to done.
We're still overwhelmed with how to do this on 15,000 acres, but we have a plan.
And last summer, Daniel saw something that filled him with hope, a creek full of running water. See, it was a really bad drought year, and in years like that, the trees along this creek, well, they seemed to just suck it dry. So he thought that this creek would be dry again this year. But the Mushrush family had removed so many trees, and the creek kept flowing.
And seeing the water flow through a stream, you see those things, you go, hey, we are doing good things here.
Okay, now, David, losing streams to trees on the prairie is a real water crisis. Scientists are really worried about this, so saving streams is a big deal. In lots of places, it is just plain too late. The trees and the shrubs have created so many holes underground in the rock that it literally just causes the rainwater to sink way too deep, and the creeks are just not going to come back. But that makes it all the more urgent for families like the Mushrushes to act now in these places where the prairie is still relatively intact. Water is everything. A running creek means lush grass for the Mushrushes' livestock and water for all the prairie critters that live there, for all the grassland birds like the prairie chickens.
We're saving the last of this ecosystem. And it goes back to what I told you a year ago. If a coral reef is worth saving, if some pristine mountain stream is worth saving, then so are the Flint Hills. I think that's the message I want to send, is just that it's not easy work, but it's worthy work. At least we have a roadmap forward.
A People's History of Kansas City was reported this month by Celia Yopis-Jepsen, with additional reporting by David Condos. It was produced by me, Mackenzie Martin, with editorial support from Scott Cannon at The Beacon, Suzanne Hogan, and Gabe Rosenberg. Mixed by Celia Yopis Jepsen with help from Byron Love and me. Special thanks this episode to David McKeel, Anna Schmidt, David Kraft, Stephen Caranda, Geneviève Desmarteau, in addition to Mark Robbins and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Macaulay Library. You heard video clips from the NRCS, the U of Nebraska, the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, TV stations KSN and Cake, and Ken Burns' Dust Bowl. Music provided by David Condos, Tom Lawney, Milktooth, and Blue Dot Sessions. We are a production of KCUR Studios, a podcast network in Kansas City, Missouri. And if you liked this episode, then you will absolutely love our new podcast, Up From Dust, which has 2 more episodes you can queue up right now by searching for Up From Dust wherever you get your podcasts. Seriously, check it out. As for us, we'll be back in your feeds in July with a wild story about a music festival that absolutely rocked the state of Missouri in more ways than one.
From what I understand, we left quite a mess there. They really pulled one on Sedalia.
Until then, I'm Mackenzie Martin. Thanks for listening.